biggest revelation in Silo Season 3, Episode 7 may not be the safeguard, the vitamin D plus in the water, or even the mystery surrounding Lucas and Kennedy after they leave Silo 18. It may be the moment Helen and Daniel look down from above and finally see the enormous drilling operation where the silos are being constructed. Until now, the silos have existed mostly as a mystery inside the story. We know people live underground. We know there are other silos. We know the system has rules that nobody is allowed to question. We know there is some kind of algorithm quietly controlling what happens inside them. But seeing those enormous structures being built in the before times changes the scale of the entire story. Somebody didn't build these places in a panic after the world ended. Somebody planned them. Somebody had the money, the technology, and the time to decide that humanity would be divided into 51 separate underground societies. And once you start looking at the story from that perspective, one possibility becomes very difficult to ignore. The silos may never have been intended simply as shelters. They may have been designed as controlled environments where humanity could be managed, observed, and tested for generations. That would explain why the system inside Silo 18 is so much more complicated than it needs to be if survival were the only objective. A shelter needs food, water, air, power, and protection from whatever destroyed the surface. It doesn't necessarily need strict rules about history. It doesn't need to erase information about the outside world. It doesn't need to punish people for discussing forbidden subjects. It certainly doesn't need a safeguard capable of killing enormous numbers of people when the population becomes a threat to the system. Yet, all of those things exist. The people inside Silo 18 aren't simply being protected from the world above them. They're being protected from information about that world and, in many cases, from information about themselves. That's why the memory storyline matters so much. The existence of technology capable of altering or suppressing memories before the silos are even finished suggests that memory control wasn't an emergency solution created after civilization collapsed. It was already part of the technological world that produced the silos. And if the people building these underground societies already understood how memories could be manipulated, then they must have had a reason to consider that technology important. This is where the 51 silos become much more interesting than simply being 51 bunkers. If the people behind the project wanted to preserve as many human beings as possible, why divide everyone into separate populations? Why not build one enormous underground city and give everyone access to the same resources? There are practical reasons for separating populations, of course, but Silo has spent too much time showing us how deliberately the separation is maintained for me to believe that the number is meaningless. Each silo appears to function as its own little civilization. It develops its own leaders, its own conflicts, its own secrets, and eventually its own relationship with the system controlling it. Yet underneath all those differences, the same basic structure exists. The same restrictions are there. The same fear of the outside exists. The same punishment exists for those who challenge the rules. That starts to look less like simple survival planning and more like a controlled experiment. If you create dozens of isolated populations and give them essentially the same basic conditions, you can observe what happens when human societies develop under different circumstances. You can see which ones remain obedient, which ones rebel, which ones collapse, and which ones find ways to survive outside the rules. And I think that possibility makes Stenson much more important than he initially appears. When Daniel and Helen meet him, we're introduced to someone who has enormous wealth and an almost obsessive interest in technology and scientific experimentation. His personality is strange enough that it's easy to dismiss some of his stories as eccentric billionaire behavior. But his conversation about the unicorn actually fits the larger theme of the season. Stenson talks about creating something that shouldn't naturally exist, and then becomes disgusted when someone wants to destroy it simply because they have the money to do so. There's something revealing about the way he thinks. He sees creation as a problem that can be solved with enough intelligence, resources, and scientific knowledge. He doesn't seem particularly interested in accepting the limits of nature. He wants to understand them and then overcome them. Now put that personality next to the construction of 51 underground civilizations, artificial intelligence, memory manipulation, and a system capable of regulating millions of people without them even understanding how it works, and suddenly Stenson's role becomes much harder to dismiss. He may genuinely believe that he's saving humanity, but that doesn't mean his idea of saving humanity has anything to do with freedom. That may actually be the central conflict between the people who created the silos and the people now living inside them. The architects of the system appear to believe that humanity is too dangerous to be trusted with complete freedom. Juliette represents almost the exact opposite philosophy. She keeps making decisions based on individual human lives, even when the larger calculation tells her that sacrificing some people would be more efficient. That's why the conversation about destroying the safeguard is so important. Bernard can look at the numbers and tell Juliette that doing nothing could potentially cost thousands of lives. The people around her can argue that sacrificing a smaller group is necessary to save everyone else. Juliette understands the logic, but she struggles with the idea that individual people can simply be reduced to numbers on a calculation. That isn't just a disagreement about tactics. It's the same philosophical argument that may have existed when the silos were first designed. Someone had to make the decision that a controlled population was preferable to a free one, and once that decision was made, everything else followed. The memory storyline strengthens that idea because the system doesn't always need to kill people to stop them from rebelling. Sometimes it only needs to remove the reason they were rebelling in the first place. That's what makes Camille's decision to put vitamin D into the water so disturbing. She doesn't have to convince the people of Silo 18 that the algorithm is right. She doesn't have to arrest everyone who supports Juliette. She only needs enough time for the population to forget what has happened. Once people lose the memories that connected them to the rebellion loses its foundation. They may still be angry, but they won't remember why. They may still have questions, but they won't remember which questions they were asking. And that is a much more sophisticated form of control than simply putting soldiers on every level of the silo. The system doesn't just control where people can go. It can potentially control what they know, what they remember, and eventually what they believe happened to them. We've already been shown the consequences of that kind of technology. Gloria's knowledge of the previous memory loss event gives Juliette something the algorithm doesn't want her to have. Historical evidence. The silo has gone through this before. People have experienced widespread memory problems before. People became confused, frightened, and desperate, and thousands died. That information is incredibly important because it suggests the system has encountered this exact problem in the past and still allows similar technology to exist. If the people who designed the silos knew that manipulating memory could destabilize an entire population, why would they continue using it? The uncomfortable answer may be that they considered the risk acceptable. If the choice was between a population that remembered enough to rebel and a population that forgot enough to remain obedient, perhaps the architects of the system decided that forgetting was the safer option. That also gives the algorithm a different meaning. We've been treating it as though it is the central villain controlling everything from behind the curtain, but it may be more accurate to think of it as the machine carrying out a philosophy that was established long before Silo 18 existed. The algorithm may not have invented the rules. It may simply be enforcing them. That would explain why the system reacts so aggressively whenever someone begins connecting the silos, questioning the outside world, or discovering information that wasn't supposed to survive. The system isn't protecting itself because it is afraid of dying. It's protecting the experiment because the people who created it decided that the experiment had to continue. And this is why Lucas and Kennedy going towards Silo 17 could become one of the most important developments of the entire season. For generations, the silos have been isolated from one another. People inside Silo 18 were never supposed to have meaningful contact with people from Silo 17. They were supposed to believe that their silo was effectively the whole world. Once two populations begin communicating, the entire psychological structure starts to fall apart. Imagine someone from Silo 18 discovering that the people in Silo 17 have their own version of the same history, the same restrictions, and the same fear of the surface. Suddenly, the strange rules inside their own silo no longer look like natural laws. They look like decisions made by someone. And once people understand that someone made the rules, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who made them, and why? That may also explain the strange sequence involving Lucas and Kennedy outside. They leave Silo 18 and encounter something that we still haven't completely understood. There's buzzing, then gunfire, then the radio goes silent. Later, Kennedy manages to make contact again while Lucas's fate remains uncertain. We don't yet have enough information to say exactly what happened, and I wouldn't pretend otherwise. But the timing is suspicious. The first real attempt to connect Silo 18 with another silo is met with immediate violence. Whether that violence came from an automated defense system, another group, or something else entirely remains one of the biggest unanswered questions. What matters for the larger theory is that the story is now moving characters across the boundaries that were supposed to keep these populations separated. Because if the 51 silos really are controlled experiments, then the worst possible development for the people who built them would be cooperation between the experiments. A single rebellious silo can potentially be contained. A group of silos sharing information becomes something completely different. Imagine Silo 18 learning everything Silo 17 knows, then passing that information to another silo and another. The algorithm would no longer be dealing with one population that needs to be controlled. It would be dealing with dozens of populations that suddenly understand they have been living under the same system. At that point, the biggest secret isn't what's outside anymore. It's the fact that everyone underground has been living inside the same experiment. And there's another reason I don't think the 51 silos were created simply because the builders needed enough space for survivors. The entire system seems obsessed with determining what people should be allowed to know. That means the architects weren't only preparing for physical survival, they were preparing for social survival. They were asking a question about human behavior. How much freedom can people have before the society becomes unstable? How much truth can people handle? How much history can be allowed to survive? How much rebellion can a population tolerate before the entire structure collapses? Those are not engineering questions. Those are questions about controlling civilization. That's why I think the eventual revelation about the 51 silos could be much darker than simply discovering what catastrophe destroyed the surface. We may learn that the catastrophe was only part of the reason the silos were created. The people behind the project may have believed that rebuilding civilization freely would simply recreate the same problems that destroyed the old world. So instead of giving humanity another chance at freedom, they decided to create a controlled version of civilization and let it continue underground until the right conditions existed for humanity to emerge again. But if that's the plan, there's one enormous flaw in it. Human beings aren't machines. You can control their environment, you can restrict their information, you can manipulate their memories. You can build walls around them and tell them the surface is deadly. But sooner or later, someone is going to question the story. Someone is going to notice something that doesn't fit. Someone is going to remember a piece of the past. Someone is going to walk outside. Someone is going to find another silo. And once that happens, the entire system depends on keeping everyone else from finding out. Juliette has already broken that pattern. She walked outside and survived. She discovered another silo. She learned that Silo 18 wasn't alone. Now Lucas and Kennedy are attempting to reach Silo 17, and Helen and Daniel are beginning to discover what existed before the silos were even finished. Those stories aren't separate anymore, they're moving toward the same revelation from opposite directions. Daniel and Helen are discovering who built the system. Juliette is discovering how the system controls people. And Lucas and Kennedy may be discovering what happens when the walls between the silos finally disappear. That's why the 51 silos may be the most important mystery left in Season 3. The number isn't frightening because there are 51 underground shelters. It's frightening because somebody had to decide that humanity should be divided into 51 isolated societies, each governed by rules designed to prevent them from discovering the truth. And if Stenson is involved in that decision, then the question isn't whether he believes he's saving humanity, he probably does. The real question is what kind of humanity he wants to save. Because the people inside Silo 18 are already showing him something he may not have expected. They don't want to be preserved, they want to be free. And if the 51 silos were built as humanity's great controlled experiment, then Juliette may be doing something far more dangerous than trying to save Silo 18. She may be proving that the experiment doesn't work.